everyone. Hello, Blockchain Conference Africa. We are really, really happy to be here today. My name is Elisha Owusu-Echao, also known as GH Crypto Guy, from Cointelegraph, social media specialist at Cointelegraph. And I'm going to be the moderator for this amazing panel on smart contract blockchains for businesses. We've seen a lot of businesses begin to use cryptocurrency and blockchain technology as everyone begins to adopt cryptocurrency and the cryptocurrency industry begins to expand. Here with me to make this discussion fruitful, we have Samy, we have Dave, and we have Viv. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hey, great to be here.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Awesome. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves. All three gentlemen are doing amazing things in the cryptocurrency space. So I'm going to start with Samy, and then we'll move on to Dave, and then Dave would introduce himself last.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here. My name is Samy. I'm supporting ecosystem development for BNB Chain. So we're supporting developers and project teams building projects on the BNB Chain infrastructure, as well as supporting them on scaling, including user scaling.
Awesome. I saw your latest rebrand from Binance Chain to BNB Chain. Great to see that you guys are doing an amazing job for the crypto space. I'll move on to.
Thank you, Elisha. Good morning, or whatever time it might be. Good evening, Africa, and all the attendees virtually. My name is Dave Yarnak. I'm the Director of Blockchain Strategy at TRON. And at TRON, we've been incredibly busy. As you know, we have a very strong presence in the APAC region, and right now we're really developing our market presence across Europe and across the US. We've been working on a number of initiatives, really all across the ecosystem. And I think over the next couple of quarters, there will be more than a few announcements of new partnerships, new projects we're working on. Notably, we just closed our first hackathon of the year and announced those winners, and the next one will be starting up in May. So be sure to participate in that. You have plenty of time to get ready. But overall, it's great to be here.
Fantastic. If you're watching as a new developer, definitely check out the upcoming hackathon. And as someone who enjoys a lot of announcements from projects, I'm really excited about what TRON may be doing next. Viv, your turn.
Thanks, Elisha. Pleased to be here. I'm Director of Strategy and Technology at the HBAR Foundation, and my primary focus is on ecosystem growth. So that also includes partnerships, developers, community, and grants, part of the grant process. So the HBAR Foundation is focused primarily on growing the ecosystem. So we provide grants to prospective founders, and we also work with systems integrators and partners across all use cases, both enterprise and not. So personally, I've been in DLT since about 2015, including founding a socially focused blockchain-backed commodities exchange in East Africa, and also through multiple roles working in Sub-Saharan Africa. So I've spent most of my career in telcos, M&A, private equity, and yeah, I'm great to be here and looking forward to this exciting panel.
Great. That's a lot of experience working with businesses. So we are going to get into the discussion now. One of the things that I was wondering when I saw the topic for this panel discussion was what are smart contract blockchains for businesses all about? So I'm going to let each panelist speak about what smart contract blockchains for businesses are about and what has been happening in that particular part of the crypto ecosystem and what the developments have been in the last couple of years. So I'm going to start with Dave.
Sure. Thanks, Elisha. So smart contracts role in business. It's a really interesting topic, and I'm glad to be able to present on it or discuss it further with this panel. I think as we move forward, decentralization right now is really in its infancy, right? And there's many business processes that, as we move along, are going to be identified as intermediaries that can be decentralized. And as this occurs, I think more and more people are going to come in to leverage these opportunities, right? And so as they do that, as the space attracts more participants, obviously there'll be more and more smart contracts developed. Now, as they become developed, I think it's critical that the thoroughness of the smart contracts is really at a high level, and they encompass really, because a smart contract is largely permanent, and it's difficult to change. It has to be done incredibly well the first time. So moving slowly, moving very methodically, and getting everything in the business that you want to be in the business and that how you want it to perform is critical and must be done correctly. As an industry, as a community, we don't want to have decentralization viewed as a high security risk or somewhere where inefficiencies thrive because they're not created correctly. And I really think that smart contracts, obviously, they play a huge role, but it's critical that they're done well. So I'll stop there.
Great insight. Viv, what is the hype all about?
Well, I think there's two things to unpack here, because when we talk about smart contracts in business, like, first of all, what is a smart contract? So if you think about, first there was Bitcoin, and that gave you a store of value, and, it was a currency, and it was in a public permissionless network. Then came programmability of real world assets, things like, bonds, equities, land rights, in the form of Ethereum, which is also on a public permissionless network. Now, the thing about what is a business then is, in a way, it's people who are willing to, or entities, I should say, who are willing to work together, but don't necessarily trust each other completely. There's obviously various reasons for not trusting each other. It could be competitive advantage. It could be trade secrets, whatever the case might be. So in the context of a business, the public permissionless network would have some utility, but in the current model, like if you forget decentralization and the holy grail of what we want the future to look like, addressing the present, the notion of what a business needs to do is still manage multi-party workflows with other businesses. And a smart contract, in a way, allows you to do this programmatically, parametrically, and in a way, it unlocks certain classes of business for decentralization that have previously been very centralized, things like exchanges. In terms of bringing liquidity and the like to previously unbanked communities, you can have smart contracts to manage self-governing entities that can bring functionality, services, visibility, data transparency. It opens up a whole lot of different applications that previously needed centralization. So you're talking about not just new models of businesses being forming and changing the very notion of what we think about as a business, but also the way existing traditional businesses, like, let's say, for example, General Electric using Google Cloud Services. These are obviously two separate multinational entities, but even they could potentially have a use for a smart contract. Like, they could have certain triggers at certain thresholds of, let's say, cloud infrastructure usage that automatically top up an account at the end of the month or trigger another set of approvals. So to me, smart contracts are a way of programmably allowing legal entities that want to work together but don't necessarily trust each other completely to have an open or common database between all their their data and systems in a way that is governed, auditable, and automated.
That's an amazing summary of what smart contract blockchains for businesses are. I'll finally take Samy, and then we'll move on to the other part of the discussion.
Sure, thanks a lot. So, yeah, I think we're seeing a lot of different types of experimentation happening in a number of different industries. So I think if we look at especially the last few years, especially the last 2 years, we've seen really the DeFi ecosystem really grow a lot of great innovation happening there, very significant growth in terms of liquidity as well as a number of users, the different types of protocols. And I think the big value there is that concept of programmable money, which we've touched as well. So there, I think we're also seeing businesses across many different sectors starting to experiment with how to leverage some of that innovation that's happening in the DeFi space. So we're seeing a lot of interesting experiments around leveraging DeFi with real-world assets, tokenized commodities, use cases around supply chain finance, which leverage DeFi lending under the hood, and a number of other areas. So I think there's creates a lot of different, a really wide canvas for innovation, including business model innovation. So here, I think the key considerations for businesses is having a really good understanding about what is the type of problems that they're trying to solve, having a good understanding about different types of risks and capabilities that they need to have a different lens compared to what they might be doing in the traditional world. So in the smart contract blockchains have a whole number of different types of considerations, smart contract risk, as well as many other types of risks that they need to consider. So that's kind of like looking at businesses that are trying to leverage the innovation happening in the DeFi space. Besides that, we're seeing a number of other types of industry consortia forming. So those are typically, let's say, industries that have a number of participants that are doing similar processes. Typically, like KYC is a very common one. And it's a shared cost among all those businesses that they have to do. It's for compliance. But using these types of infrastructure allows them to share that cost among all the participants and really optimize and improve the inefficiencies, improve the efficiency there. So I think these type of consortia, we've seen a number of them already going live and have been operating for a while. And I think more and more will try to digitize other types of processes and workflows, including like documents or other types of things there as well. And then really start seeing more on-chain assets also being automated through smart contracts. So that's also kind of like very clear trend that's happening at the moment. And I think super exciting to see how more and more businesses are starting to experiment, especially in the public permissionless infrastructure side.
Super. If you're watching us live, keep your questions coming. I see we already have some questions. I'm definitely going to ask our panelists to tell us what they think about those questions. But I think if you've been taking notes or you need to take some notes, I think a great summary of what we've heard from all three panelists is that we need to decentralize everything, and we need to decentralize the processes that businesses use when it comes to the way they run their affairs, the way they work with other projects. And for us to do this, we need to make sure that it's happening in a risk-free environment and it is easy to set up. At the end of the day, smart contract blockchains for businesses make it very, very easy for companies to work with each other without necessarily having to trust each other, because all of this is trustless and is auditable on the blockchain. Fantastic insights from our panelists. So I think this generally kind of gives us an idea of what the purpose of smart contracts blockchains for businesses are. So my next question would be that what are the benefits? Why should Google get a smart contract? Why should a random fashion brand get a smart contract besides NFTs, obviously? But why should they get a smart contract? I'm going to start with it.
Sure. So if you take out the more emerging uses of smart contracts, as you rightly said, NFTs and the like, then I think the main benefit that immediately comes to mind is things like reconciliation. So again, sticking with my example of, let's say, General Electric and Google Cloud Services, they both have their own accounting of how much cloud resourcing was used. They both have their own way of logging this, of sending this to finance, of finance, triggering the payments and the like. Why does it have to be two separate systems? And in the event of having any sort of discrepancy, you now have a process of reconciliation. Like I've given you a very simple example between two rather big global players, but if you look at something, for example, in the insurance value chain, you could have so many hops. You could have a a retail client to a retail insurer to a reinsurer to a retrocessionaire. From the retrocessionaire, they might decide to securitize it, and you have a whole lot of. Sorry, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Sorry. So you end up with a whole lot of players, each of whom are keeping the same records. Now, instead of that, if you could use a DLT and think of DLT or blockchain in the context of a immutable append-only ledger, and then you could have smart contracts as a way of triggering certain actions based on events or immutable state on the ledger, then in effect, what you're bringing to the table is a way of eliminating reconciliation and automating tasks, things that are quite time consuming and both resource and cost intensive. Now, on top of that, in terms of sort of what else you can do around this, in a way, the fact that smart contracts in a way don't necessarily belong to any given domain. They don't necessarily belong to the finance domain. They don't necessarily belong to, the payments domain per se. And the fact that they are cross-domain, it allows you to actually synchronize a lot more services into a composable backbone of things that need to happen for a business outcome, rather than having to think of this in terms of, okay, here's this finance function, here's this vendor management function, here's this other function, etc. So it allows you to make composable business outcomes by leveraging technology and eliminating a lot of the bloat and reconciliation. So to me, that's one of the big pros from the business perspective. And on top of that as well, it allows you to automate certain things like I touched on insurance, which just made me think of something else. If you have parametric insurance with things like catastrophe bonds, you can easily have what is today a very labor-intensive special purpose vehicle with managing agents, with payment agents, with bond issuance agents, underwriters, etc., in the form of a DAO. So, to me, the main benefits, the main pros, if you will, for a smart contract in enterprise are eliminate reconciliation, streamline your operations, reduce your cost, increase your velocity.
Awesome. Samy, what would you say the benefits of smart contract blockchains are for business?
It's a good question. I think it's something that we talk about a lot with enterprises, governments, businesses that are ideating use cases. So I would say public permissionless blockchains can solve some problems, but not all. So I think it's important that businesses, enterprises define really well what's the type of problem that they want to solve. Because for some things, blockchains are not very efficient. This is that use case or problem requires storing a lot of data on chain. That is not going to be a kind of an efficient way to use, especially public permissionless. Blockchain is going to cost a lot, but blockchains are very good for certain other things, especially things that involve value transfer, like payments and other types of things like that, but also a range of other use cases. So I think I agree a lot with what we've said. Another way to, I think, look at it is around processes that require synchronizing state of disconnected systems. So I think that's something that especially public permissionless blockchains can do really well, is acting as that state coordination layer among disparate systems. So in the case of BNB chain, for example, it is like a general purpose blockchain. So I think we do see like a wide variety of different types of use cases and applications being built on top of it. But I think the really key thing is for these businesses to design and evaluate those use cases appropriately in order to really be able to achieve their intended outcomes and gain the maximum value and benefits that they're looking to achieve.
So, Dave, same question.
Yeah, thanks. So what Viv and Sammy said, I think everything was exactly right. So I'll give you some examples of my experience with using smart contracts. So one of the things I worked on was developing a system for parametric insurance that, like Viv was mentioning, where this was related to flood insurance, where if in the event of heavy rains and a flood, we could leverage the National Weather Service as an oracle, and any house within that or building, whatever, within that designated flood area would automatically receive their payment or insurance payout from the company through smart contracts. It was much more efficient. It was very well received by government agencies. And in doing things like that, it makes, I think, in parametric insurance events, it becomes critical to, the need is to get the people affected by some type of event, get them their payout as soon as possible to make sure that they can move on with their lives. And that's what this was doing. And then, I think moving on, supply chains have really been some of the fastest and largest adopters of blockchain technology as well as smart contracts. And you're seeing that you're able to see smart contracts be applied throughout the whole process, from everything from orders to trade finance to delivery to shipment. They're utilized everywhere in supply chain, and I think you're going to continue to see that to grow. Now, moving topics or moving industries a bit. So think about it in terms of where it's more emerging in terms of music. I think eventually, I think we're seeing more music being developed into NFTs, and I think probably the highest profile one most recently is Snoop Dogg with Death Row Records, wanting to bring that into more of an entirely NFT space. I think what's going to be critical from an artist standpoint is that the terms that they're comfortable with, the terms that are written into that smart contract when it's deployed, and because it will be incredibly difficult to change otherwise or afterwards. So they need to be completely comfortable with everything, and then moving forward, they'll be able to realize the benefits. And that's another thing, kind of when we talk about decentralization and smart contracts, it's really ownership and privacy that are being brought in on a much greater level than really ever before. So I'll stop there.
Interesting. So moving away from why these companies definitely need to use smart contract blockchain, sorry, and probably deploy a smart contract or two. What are the elements needed to facilitate the adoption of smart contracts by businesses? I'll start with
It's a really good question. So I think there's a number of really key consideration enterprises, business need to be thinking about. So it also depends, of course, on the type of business. So if it's like a B2C, like consumer-facing, retail-focused business, I need to be thinking a lot about what that end-user experience looks like. So ideally, that experience for the user should be seamless. Like a lot of the users, end users, uh, don't even need to know that there's a blockchain powering this under the hood. It becomes like it becomes quite seamless and also abstracts a lot of the complexity. For example, for users that need to manage their own keys, private keys, for example, becomes a very big friction point. But today you do have a lot of great developer tooling as well as um, innovation happening at the user experience layer that abstracts away a lot of that complexity. So gives users that like Web 2.0 experience that like most users are very familiar with, like login with Google, login with Facebook. But under the hood, it's a non-custodial wallet, but the user doesn't have to secure a seed phrase or private keys or anything like that. So using technologies like distributed keys and other things like that. Um, so I think the end user experience for certain types of businesses, the businesses should pay attention to that. I think other important things is the type of developer tooling and I'd say like ancillary infrastructure that's also required when building applications on blockchain. So I need to ensure that there's like mature developer tools, all the other types of infrastructure besides the actual like layer one or layer two blockchain itself, like things like data indexing and a lot of other types of infrastructure required. So I think those are other key considerations businesses should be really paying attention to, especially once if things go really well with what they're developing and they start achieving significant user traction and growth, those things will become increasingly important for them. So I think these are a number of key areas that enterprises and businesses should be looking at from even from early design stages in the plan.
Interesting points there. I think the part about the blockchain running in the background and users not even having to like have to know what's going on, because it's very difficult for people to use blockchain technology sometimes, and not everybody is a geek or a nerd. And I'm using these words in the positive sense, or not everybody is like so good at navigating MetaMask. So that's a very good point. I'll take Viv. What do you think the elements we need to facilitate the adoption of smart contracts? Like,
So I completely agree with everything Samy said. That actually sounds like that's great advice off the bat. But then even before reaching for a blockchain or a smart contract solution, I think first the business needs to understand whether or not that is the best solution for the profile of work that the business does and what its transactions look like. So a concrete example would be a stock exchange. The order matching at this point, I've yet to see a stock exchange actually do the order matching on a blockchain. But blockchain is a perfect candidate for post-trade settlement because you have a single source of data, you have all your triggers, you can use your smart contracts for handling all your margins, everything, CCPs, payments, the lot. So in that sense, first of all, you need to understand whether or not this is whether the business has a blockchain use case in the first place, because and I guess this is probably not the conference to be talking about this, but sometimes a relational database is probably your best bet. It's 50-year-old technology. Everyone gets it. It's simple to understand. The other thing as well is it's not just about using the blockchain, it's also operating the blockchain. And there's quite a heavy lift on the operation side. And I think traditionally, the industry, both blockchain and IT as a whole, always targets the business people and the developers. But very little thought is given to your operations people who are going to run this in production and who are going to be investigating things when it's 3:00 in the morning on a Saturday and everyone's asleep and you want to know why your payments are not going through. So I think understand whether you need a blockchain or not. The tooling and the education, absolutely critical. Now, in terms of when you deploy a smart contract, who signs off on that? So I think language has a big part to play in this, and both language directly, but also low code or no code solutions that can compile down into native smart contracts. Because I think human beings by nature are visual people. We had cave paintings before we had writing, sort of thing. That's a bit of a stretch, but you bear with me. Humor me. So in a way, if people can look at a network diagram or a process flow diagram and understand, okay, so at this point, this certain action by the user triggers these subsequent actions behind the scenes, it's easier for them to reason the smart contract. And if it's easier to reason, it's easier to debug. So I think if I were to put them in some level of order, first understand the profile of transactions for the business and whether or not a blockchain is suitable. Secondly, look at how you're going to run this thing if it goes into production and you're successful. Third, educate the people to be able to understand what the system is supposed to be doing as a whole. I think those would be my three. And if I have room for a fourth, always do your POCs as a greenfield. Don't rock the boat or disrupt the people or make them feel uncomfortable ahead of time, because you got to understand that this is still in its infancy and it might not go anywhere. There's no point incurring any sort of angst, if you will.
Interesting. I think there has been a lot of discussion, and it's even a meme on Twitter, and people ask this question: does blockchain really fix everything? And I like the way you had a very important clarity in there about how people don't need to rush to blockchain just because it is the new thing in town. Dave, what do we need to facilitate the adoption of smart contracts by?
Yeah. First, great question. I think a lot about adoption and what will drive adoption. So I completely agree with Samy. I think user experience is incredibly important. It's important. It's proven to be important throughout technology adoption and will still continue to do so. I think Viv is spot on that blockchain isn't necessarily correct for every solution. So I'm going to take it a little bit of a different way. So let's say, right now, gaming and play to earn gaming is really becoming widespread around the world. And what it's doing is, in certain areas, it's providing a new source of income, a better source of income, a better source of earning than people can get in their local economy, right? So they can log on, play Axie Infinity, and earn a living doing that, right? So now they receive their payment for that, but let's say they're paid in tokens. They need to be able to exchange those tokens for everyday goods and services at their local market. And what's needed for that, I think you need cross-chain operability, and really, greater acceptance overall of cryptos. But it's that type of activity that is going to lead to not only greater adoption or crypto normalization, and being able to spend it in everyday places, but then also that's going to facilitate and foster greater decentralization and therefore greater smart contract adoption by businesses. So, yeah, that's kind of my take on it from this point.
Interesting. Let's look at some things that could make it difficult for people to want to adopt smart contract blockchains. I think there's a conversation about scalability and scalable infrastructure. Um, are we at the point where we could pick just any blockchain and start deploying smart contracts on those particular blockchains, or do we have to be extra careful with the scalability infrastructure that exists? Because in as much as some blockchains like Ethereum may have scalability concerns, people would still want to deploy on Ethereum because it's the most popular and it's what most developers are probably building in. So I think that's an interesting aspect of the conversation we equally need to look at. And I'll start with Dave because he's from TRON, and I'm sure he has some insight. And then I'll go to Samy from BNB Chain, and then I'll come to Viv.
Sure, yeah. So talking about people getting started on blockchain, deploying their smart contracts, I think, and you can call me biased if you want, but really the facts are that Tron is the lowest cost blockchain to develop on. You're not spending money on gas fees or energy or bandwidth at Tron. So by being low cost, it's actually more inclusive and more accessible to more people around the world. So that's a big benefit, huge benefit. One of the reasons I really like the technology. Secondly, so adopting, so the low cost is one thing, but then, scalability, right? Scalability, when you talk about smart contract scalability, I think what you're really talking about is scalability of blockchains and that capability. And, I think if it was me, if I was doing it, what makes most sense is you want to keep your costs low to develop. You can do that. And then by using Tron and BitTorrent chain, you then have access. BitTorrent chain is our bridge or cross-chain solution. You have access to both BNB chain as well as Ethereum chains, right? So you can keep your costs low and then still have access to everything that's on other chains, which makes a lot of sense to do. From a scalability point, it's not only scalability, but also about reliability. And I think, thinking about it in terms of the blockchain trilemma, I think Tron is leading in that as well, just in terms of speed. The speed is excellent. We haven't had any kind of clogging issues or capacity issues. So I'm obviously a big advocate of Tron and the BitTorrent chain.
Let's move on to BNB Chain. Samy.
Yeah, sure. So I think we spend a lot of time thinking really about scalability. And I think there's a lot of considerations there. I think there typically the block production or like on-chain scaling and these kind of things is not really the bottleneck. It's more about other parts of infrastructure that's much harder to scale, especially things like node RPC infrastructure. So there are kind of more a lot of key considerations. But today we also see like a lot of scaling solutions and different types of experimentation. I think jury is still out in terms of what are the kind of technical architectures and other types of things. And there, I think it's important that there's choice for developers to experiment with different types of use cases, which may be more suited for certain types of chain architectures and other things like that. But I think really like we're also seeing like not long ago we're talking about this idea of a multi-chain future, which today we see is like multi-chain reality with a lot of ecosystem emerging, a lot of different types of users. But I would use the analogy of really more like countries and why people choose to live in certain countries. It could be related to the weather or infrastructure or other types of things. And I think chains are very similar. It's like where your favorite NFT marketplaces or the access points or how users are able to move assets with ease between whatever their favorite exchange or whatever that might be, right? So it's like kind of like user preferences. I think eventually for applications as well, and we see that happening a lot in the DeFi space, are also multi-chain because that means that they are really accessing more of a total addressable market because that's really driven by user preferences. So I see that's really the direction of how things are going, and with a lot of new capacity and new chains emerging, I think today we have much less issue with issues around scalability and like a lot of activity happening on one particular chain where all the DeFi activity is happening, and there's like recurring high transaction fees pricing out certain users, which is a little bit like antithesis to what, especially the whole DeFi movement was trying to achieve.
Awesome. All too soon. We are almost out of time. So I'm going to let Viv answer the same question on scalability. And I'm going to take one question from the audience and then we are going to call it a day. It's been an amazing session so far.
Yeah. All right, I'll be brief. So unpacking that scalability, I think there's actually two sides of it. There's scalability in terms of the total addressable universe of crypto out there. So if you're talking about the EVM universe, it's not just Ethereum, it's also the derivatives thereof. And then you have scalability of the infrastructure itself. Now, Samy hit on an absolutely critical point in terms of pricing people out of being able to actually operate on a infrastructure. So to me, ultimately, it comes down to the performance for a given cost. So, if you look at variable gas fees, as tends to be the case, then literally you're now exposed to all kinds of risks around what your actual transaction cost is going to be. There are certain classes of attacks, like, say, front-running Sybil attacks with shared mempools, etc. I realize I'm getting a bit technical here, but in a nutshell, the more you pay, you can have your transactions come to the front of the queue, etc. So I think the notion of utility and scalability that is required when you have enough utility that your sort of ecosystem has grown that big is ultimately, I think, a function of sort of your cost and the ability to make sure that your transactions reach finality at an acceptable cost, and each person's acceptable cost is different. And also, once it reaches finality, it is final. So, shameless plug, obviously, I come from the HBAR Foundation. Hedera L1 isn't a proof of work. We don't do mining. Instead, it's a proof of stake, and we use a gossip about gossip protocol to come to finality. Now, what this means is we can hit absolute finality in 3 to 5 seconds, and we can sustain 10,000 plus transactions per second on average. Now, how much does all this cost? Less than 1/10,000 of a cent on average for a crypto transfer. So just to put things in perspective, if you're trying to do a cross-border payment and you're trying to do this through, say, Ethereum, and you're paying $20 per transaction on a small remittance of what is about $5, $6, $7 US, then it doesn't make a lot of sense. Whereas if you're doing the same transaction on Hedera rails and your 8, 9, 10 US dollar transaction is costing you fractions of a cent, it makes a lot more sense. So the notion of scalability needs to come down ultimately to utility. Now, in terms of interoperability with other chains, we launched a smart contract service, and that is fully EVM compatible. And the foundation has been investing very heavily in grantees who are applying for grants to build things like DEXs and bridges and currency pairs for exactly this reason. So, yeah, those are the two types of scalabilities and the different challenges and approaches as I see them.
Awesome. So I would have asked you all to give me your last word, but I'm going to make your last word for this particular session an answer to a question. So I'm going to need a one-line answer to this particular question that is coming in from one of our watchers. He is asking, in your opinion, what is the most applicable impact? Right. So, in your opinion, what is your most applicable impact in terms of use case for Africa, application in use or being created? So, I don't know who wants to go first. Just a one-line answer. What do you think the biggest use case for smart contract blockchains for businesses could be on the African continent? Who wants to go first?
I'll go first because I'm already unmuted. Banking the unbanked, absolutely has to be done. Has to be done. Long overdue.
Totally agree. Samy?
I would say redefining financial applications.
Interesting. Banking the unbanked, redefining financial applications. Dave?
I'll say creating DAOs of people with shared interests to facilitate growth?
I think that's interesting because Africa already has a sense of community as part of our culture when it comes to investment and raising businesses. So that definitely is an amazing one. Thank you so much, Dave, Samy, and Viv. This has been an amazing discussion. Thank you all to those of you who sent questions and we couldn't ask them all, sorry, because of the time. But thank you so much for joining us and see you soon.
My pleasure. Thank you for having
All right.
us.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.